Hi, I'm Ashleigh Whedon. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Guelph, and I'm delighted to be co-presenting a session with Dr. Kyle Rich, who's an assistant professor at Brock University, and we're presenting this work based on this great social media account in Toronto called ParkdaleLife that's really all about how we use place-based social media as a form of community activation, resistance to gentrification, and reclaiming the sense of a right to the city and a sense of belonging in place. And we've called it The Future Will Not Be Instagrammed, and we presented this at the Canadian Sociological Association for the 2021 Congress this year and wanted to make sure that we got it to as many people as possible, so we're recording it for you guys here as well. What we're covering today is really talking about how we can use social media or microblogging platforms like Instagram, Twitter, others as a source material for uncovering all of these really interesting conversations around digitally mediated place and their interaction with kind of our geospatial realities, and how those forces combine when we're looking at the pressures of gentrification, reclaiming the right to the city, and what this looks like in terms of positioning place and community as a public good, as a collective right, rather than the individual commodified and commercialized thing that it's turning into in a lot of places. So we're really going to cover what we mean by gentrification of place and the right to the city, as well as social media source material for uncovering the narratives around these experiences as a social process. And Kyle's going to get into all of the really great stories related to Parkdale itself as a neighborhood, and then ParkdaleLife as a digitally mediated presence of Parkdale and how that showed up as a powerful social force, and talk a little bit about our reflections and the implications of these kind of implications as we go forward in looking at this kind of intersection between technology and social life. So when we talk about gentrification and the right to the city and a progressive sense of place, these are sort of three concepts that really rely and interact with each other in an interesting and dynamic way. When we look at gentrification, we're really talking about the slow, almost gradual, it's happening until all of a sudden it's happened to you process where communities turn into sites of consumption rather than sites of collective identity and experience and public value. And we see this happen not through like a community revitalization process or an urban renewal process where there's a concerted and purposeful effort in the direction of making sure that it's a holistic experience for everyone in a community. Rather, instead, we're seeing things like a Starbucks will pop up, or a Whole Foods, or a really expensive boutique. And this starts to happen as people in higher paying positions or who are able to own capital and buildings start to displace poor and working class people in communities that rely on those communities as their home, as their sense of community, and their sense of claiming that right to the city, which is really about the freedom to make and remake the urban environment as a site for building collective life, rather than this late stage capitalist interpretation of what a city and an urban process looks like. So we're really looking at this idea of, rather than something to be consumed, something to be built and experienced and related to as a form of identity and belonging. And this plays into Doreen Massey's progressive sense of place, which really expresses this notion that places and neighborhoods, communities, they're not always necessarily clearly bounded. They're usually messy and conflicted and full of all of these overwhelming and overlapping dynamic relationships and identities, which are constituted through time and always in process. And place is a critical modifier and contextual element and leverage point for all of our social, economic, and cultural processes. So everything that we experience in life is mediated through our belonging and sense of place. And this runs right up against our experiences of digitally mediated spaces where we're getting an argument that borders don't matter and that you can be somewhere and nowhere all at the same time. And really what we're showing through the experience of ParkdaleLife, and this as a place-based social media campaign and presence, is that place still does matter in terms of our experience of community and how we constitute those things. So I'm going to turn it over to Kyle to talk a bit about Parkdale itself as a community, ParkdaleLife as a social media account, and the stories involved in this that we chose to explore.
Thanks, Ashleigh. So I'm going to start with a brief kind of history of Parkdale as a neighborhood. So for those of you who may not be familiar, Parkdale is a neighborhood in the southwest corner of Toronto. So you see on our little map there, basically runs from the Gardiner to the south, Dufferin on the east, the train tracks to the north, and Roncesvalles on the west. So originally Parkdale was incorporated as an autonomous village, but it was shortly after annexed by the city of Toronto, and then it was really marketed as this like garden suburb. So a place where these wealthy elites could get away from the hustle and bustle and dirty downtown city, and escape to their Victorian estate homes and access different types of leisure typically on their weekend. So the attend things like the cinemas that were on Queen Street West, or the Sunnyside Amusement Park. So the Sunnyside Amusement Park was an amusement park located right on the corner of Parkdale. It was basically Toronto's version of Coney Island. So this amusement park on the water that brought the kind of wealthy people out there for their weekends. But throughout the 1900s, there was a series of kind of changes that really changed the way Parkdale looked and what the community felt like. So in the 1950s, there was a demolition of the Sunnyside Amusement Park, followed by the construction of the Gardiner Expressway. And so what the construction of the Gardiner did was it really cut off Parkdale from the water and cut off that access to that important kind of draw that was bringing people into the neighborhood. And then in the 1970s and 80s, there was a closure of the Lakeshore Psychiatric Facility, followed by the deinstitutionalization of the Queen Street Mental Health Center. And so what this did was change the look of the people in Parkdale. So there was different people in the community. There was a rise in single occupancy dwellings to house these new occupants. And this really changed the neighborhood and the community and what it looked like. So there's really great work by Epstein on these kind of early changes in gentrification, where they map some of the ways that the people moving in at this time, so the more wealthy middle class white Torontonians who were moving in and investing in property in the area. So these are these, old Victorian estate homes, so large places. And Epstein described them as an enlightened urban middle class. So folks who were interested in certain forms of encounters with difference, but not all forms. So different bodies were treated differently. Some were seen as welcome and part of the community, as you might call it, and then others who weren't and who were they were seeking to kind of push these less palatable versions of difference out in the community. So a really kind of interesting history of the way this has developed and moved into what we would now see or call gentrification. So these kind of more recently, forces around migration, activism, and gentrification have really shaped what is known as Parkdale. So now in the city, Parkdale is also known as Little Tibet because of waves of Tibetan migrants in the 1990s. And this is wrapped up in Epstein's analysis of the kind of palatable others, right? Or the folks who were welcomed as the diverse groups within the community. So there's a range of really interesting restaurants and kind of community resources that are organized around there. There was also really interesting movements and developments. The neighborhood was host to the city's first Mad Pride, so a kind of celebration of different types of folks, neurodiverse folks who have sought different types of services. And this was really picked up and celebrated by the neighborhood, but also by the city broadly. So the city made some declarations around that, and the identity was really constructed in kind of multiple different ways. But then importantly, now, like many areas of the city, there has been a kind of astronomical rise in housing costs and the cost of property. And this is changing what Parkdale looks like now and who is able to access space and afford to live in these kind of spaces. So in this context, we have the introduction of ParkdaleLife. So as we mentioned, we're framing this as a place-based social media presence or campaign. And ParkdaleLife began in 2015, really as an Instagram account that was sharing raw imagery of life in the community. So everything from the encounters with difference in the liquor store parking lot to the crazy raccoons that seem to be omnipresent and climbing in your windows and finding ways to access your house in ways that you didn't expect, or just showing up to say hello where you don't expect them to. So it really started as this, but then through these kind of amplifying images, the imagery and what it looks like, what life looks like in the neighborhood, they became involved in this construction of community in a few different ways. So for this kind of analysis, we drew from the posts from the Parkdale Life Instagram account, content from their blog, as well as a range of media coverage that has also played a really important role in kind of shaping this narrative about Parkdale life and life in Parkdale. And so we're going to take you through some of those now. We're going to share a few vignettes from that experience, and then I'll pass it back to Ashleigh after that for some more analysis and what we can learn from this. So the first kind of vignette that we want to talk through involved the no frills. So there's a large no frills at Dundas and Lansdowne, and for a time it was closed for repairs. And this was a major concern in the community because no frills is a source of accessible or affordable food for many people in the community. And without this kind of large source, there was concerns about where people would be able to access that kind of affordable food sources. So they were running a bus, for example, from this no frills parking lot to another no frills, so people were able to take the bus to pick up their groceries. But there was also a concern that, like other kind of large no frills in these rapidly changing neighborhoods, it may not open and it may go the way of Honest Ed's and eventually become a condo development instead of going back to being the no frills. So to commemorate when no frills did open back up, thankfully for the residents of the neighborhood, Parkdale Life created a set of t-shirts. So you can see it on the image here. It was the kind of Parkdale Life words combined with the No Frills logo. And so these t-shirts were sold out of a cardboard box on a front lawn. It was a very grassroots campaign, and all of the proceeds were donated to the Parkdale Food Bank, which is a community organization that directly addresses food insecurity, or definitely works on food insecurity in the neighborhood. To Parkdale Life's surprise, they were contacted by folks from No Frills and basically asked them to cease and desist with their work because it was infringing on their brand and their image. So this was a surprise, not unexpected. But eventually, through conversations, it was suggested that they could work together, that No Frills would make a donation to the Parkdale Food Bank as well, and that this would be kind of respun as a positive thing. It's noteworthy that this was a slow news day in Toronto, and it did get quite a bit of news coverage, this little fundraiser. So this is likely how No Frills became aware of it. It's also noteworthy that No Frills is part of the Loblaws chain. It's owned by the kind of infamous Canadian Weston family, who is a large kind of business presence. And this is also at the same time that it would come out later that Loblaws was fixing the price of bread and like doing some of these things that kind of makes you question their motives. So eventually, though, the No Frills was able to spin this as kind of a positive corporate social responsibility initiative. They made their donation, and that was that. The next vignette that we'll share is in relation to what was affectionately referred to as the Vegandale Saga. So a large corporation called 5700 is a vegan-oriented corporation, and they bought a bunch of storefronts at the kind of west end of Parkdale near the Queen and Dufferin space, and they were moving in a series of vegan-oriented businesses. So this in itself is not a problematic thing. It's just a thing. Change happens. Businesses turn over, new things move into storefronts. But when 5700 was moving in, and their businesses that came in were also coming with a lot of this kind of really abrasive messaging about the moral superiority of veganism. So things like the brewery moving in with their slogan "Morality on Tap" and their superior, morally superior IPA, and this was really being kind of thrown in the face of community members. And what this really did was overlooked the lived experiences of the people who live there, overlooked the kind of cultural practices of diverse folks in the neighborhood, and the way that they may, take up some of these conversations as well. And it went so far as there was a series of mock-ups published in true kind of condo developer form of a neighborhood that was this kind of vegan utopia with all these vegan-run businesses. And it was called, not insignificantly, Vegandale, to play on the name of Parkdale. So really forwarding the imagery of, removing all of the others that they wouldn't want there and replacing them with these kind of pro-vegan individuals and businesses. So Parkdale Life, working with the Parkdale Land Trust, organized a community meeting in response to this. They organized it on the same day that 5700 was organizing a vegan block party, to kind of bring community members out and engage them in some discussion around what Parkdale as a community would like to see. And so this resulted in a list of community demands. This was also covered in the media quite extensively, and it was picked up kind of broadly through social media, through the social media platform as well. So needless to say, 5700 was not a fan of ParkdaleLife and not a fan of the resistance that was kind of mobilized around this. And so as a kind of final vignette, because every story needs to have an end, in the past year during the pandemic, the decision was made to hand off the Parkdale account and its large kind of following to the Parkdale Food Bank. So I believe ParkdaleLife was up over 60,000 followers at a time. And so by turning that over to the Parkdale Food Bank, they were able to turn over this big following, a huge audience, and the food bank was able to, pick up on this following, use it for their fundraising, use it to get their message out and generate awareness for their initiatives and the things that they were working on. ParkdaleLife was confident that they had the kind of skills and the people in place to make this work and to use it for good. And really, this is an interesting way to end this chapter because it is representative of the idea of, turning this thing that was created back over to the community in a way that might continue to generate some positive outcomes for individuals in the community and for a cause that a community organization is working towards. So with that, I'll pass this back over to Ashleigh for a little bit of analysis and implications.
Thank you so much. And I truly love all of the vignettes that have come about through looking at the experience and the narrative arc of ParkdaleLife as an account, and then in our supreme, good luck and good fortune to get to talk with the forces behind ParkdaleLife and learn more about what that was like from the inside as the experience of driving these conversations somewhat accidentally. So one good thing that's come through these conversations and through earlier presentation of this material was, this is a much different project than a community oriented project that's purposely designed to get people to feel a sense of belonging and get behind a cause. All of this happened sort of organically by a person that saw the quirky, fun, interesting things, weird things, good, bad, and ugly about the place that they lived in, and wanted to share those because they found them personally interesting, funny, weird, good, bad, and ugly. And it galvanized all of this interesting stuff from other people, right? Other people saw themselves, saw their community, felt that they belonged to that place through that expression, and outsiders, right? You started to get a sense for what Parkdale felt like through these stories in this Instagram account. And so in this way, blogs or microblogs is the technical term for platforms like Instagram or Twitter, provide us with, unexpectedly rich, deep, personal accounts and fertile source material for exploring what these social experiences and processes are like, often in real time. These are things that are happening always iteratively and interoperatively with each other, with sort of an interlocation between myself and the place I'm in and this digitally mediated platform that I'm engaged in. And so we've taken a really collaborative approach by working directly with ParkdaleLife itself, to put them sort of in this. It's a very important part of putting them at the center of the process as an active participant, not just a subject of this kind of analysis and exploration, because doing so helps us surface some of these unexplored and maybe unheard stories and narratives behind the processes that went into making ParkdaleLife what it became. And so this also gives us deeper insight into what the messy, ongoing, interesting process of reclaiming that right to the city is like for real people, rather than just high-minded rhetoric around what this would look like in an ideal world. This is sort of the tension between what that feels like in practice, particularly by someone who really didn't start out with an agenda for this kind of thing. And so these vignettes serve as an interesting piece of source material, as well as the critical and reflexive lens for exploring the intersection of social media and our increasingly digitally mediated experience of the world around us with the more geophysical experiences of place and placemaking, and how this kind of can serve as a new and interesting process around community activation and resistance, without necessarily calling it that, without necessarily putting a label on this as community activation. Instead, it comes from the place and of the place and has a really interesting tone and content to it. The popularity of these the hosts that have come up, and I mean, who can't love a note around lost ferret and have you lost a ferret? You know, the matchup between these two is pretty wonderful. But they provide a reflection of community change over time, which is, as Kyle noted when we were talking about the history of Parkdale, is maybe almost, you know, an originally gentrified concept for a neighborhood, and how that has shifted as its life cycle has evolved. Also reinforces this notion and the argument that our sense of our right to belong or our right to the city is most strongly articulated when we feel like it's under threat. And so we often think about these things or don't think about them at all until we perceive something like Vegandale, or the closure of an affordable grocery store, or the change in a really substantive way that affects the way we interact with a place happens. And that's when then all of a sudden we have this feeling of claiming our right to the city and that right to belonging. When we think about what this means and you know, why look at this as an important social process, is that, you know, it really does reflect existing literature, which is hard to believe. You know, Massey's argument around a progressive sense of place is from 1991, because if you read that piece in Marxism Today, it will feel like it was written this year. It really articulates the idea that place is always in constant conflict and negotiation. There's never really a sense of settledness about place. And that's actually a good thing in terms of how we generate new conversations and continue to move things forward. In the same time, in ParkdaleLife, their own account of the experience of building this account, using it as a tool of resistance somewhat unexpectedly, and then handing it over to a community organization like a food bank, emphasizes that generative nature of community building in place, and how those life cycles of community change feel, look, and are experienced by the people that are there already, rather than necessarily the people that are coming in, or even the people who have been placed out already. So it's always this interesting conversation. It also emphasizes that some things just don't transfer to other places. So we see this a lot in place-based approaches to community building or capacity building, or any of these kinds of things, that we think a strategy that'll work one place will work another. And I know ParkdaleLife told us about seeing mimic accounts from somewhere like Forest Hill Life. Well, Forest Hill Life isn't going to have the same tenor and tone and even sort of grittiness to it, because what do the people in Forest Hill, a very affluent neighborhood in Toronto, what is the threat to them that isn't they're already gentrified this place, right? It's they're already there. They have been the threat. Any outcoming threats to them would be from the opposite direction. And so we need to kind of reconsider our notions around what this looks like in practice from inside and on the ground, and that really important contextual modifier that place becomes. And then finally, we do need to keep in mind that as things like Instagram, you know, influencer culture, and all of the things that go with that become increasingly commercialized and co-opted by essentially gentrification of a digitally mediated space, that this has the potential to happen when it comes to these kinds of accounts as well. And we do know that there were opportunities that came ParkdaleLife's way around paying them for the use of their platform, around using this as a messaging tool. And that really didn't jive with what was going on. And so this choice to hand it over to the food bank, especially considering that they had the people in place that could use this platform well, was something that was being guarded against to prevent late stage capitalism, exploitation, and extraction becoming part of this process, not only in the geophysical sense, in the sense of Parkdale as a neighborhood, but also in this digitally mediated space on Instagram. So these all kind of combine to think about how do we approach these processes as social processes and as community building initiatives, and really reflect on the way that internet and society are challenging the way we think about place and space and who has a right to belong and a right to claim those things. We've really enjoyed working on this project. I've loved getting to work with Kyle, and I'll turn it over to him for a few other comments to wrap us up. But first, I did want to say the raccoons are against gentrification. This is another image from ParkdaleLife that we both love. And if you would really like to support initiatives that are happening in Parkdale, for Parkdale, and by Parkdale, you can support the food bank, the land trust, or the legal fund through any of the links listed here. So I'll turn it over to Kyle to wrap us up, but I hope that we get to continue digging into these kinds of things as they continue to kind of explode all over the place.
Thanks so much. I'll just wrap up by saying thanks for sticking it out with us and learning about this project. If you have more questions, you can contact either of us. We'll link our information in the description, and we'll also put these links there as well. So you can check out these organizations, and I encourage you to check them out and support what they do. Thanks so much.